Scripture reading this morning is from 2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 to 11. We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God, who raises the dead. And he did rescue us from mortal danger, and he will rescue us again. We have placed our confidence in him, and he will continue to rescue us. And you are helping us by praying for us. Then many people will give thanks because God has graciously answered so many prayers for our safety.
So, when's the last time someone pointed a gun at you? By the look on your face, what kind of question is that? By the look on your face, it's been a while, right? It's been a while. You know, looking down a barrel of a gun the wrong direction does get your heart going, doesn't it? Has life become kind of boring? You know, as I said, it's been a while, right? Has life become kind of boring for you? Not that boring is bad, necessarily. Just to be clear. Now, today we're going to talk about God's school of brokenness. He develops our character in this school if we cooperate with him. As we talk this morning, I'm going to ask you to think about people that are in positions of authority over you. This could be people like your parents, your teachers, your boss, the foreman at work, your supervisor. Maybe that you've given your spouse a position of authority in your life. If at church, it could be the pastor or some kind of leader in the church. If you are the pastor, it could be just about anybody else in the church. That was supposed to be funny. Now, in this sermon, at times I will refer to those people in authority in your life as your king. And we're continuing our series in 1 Samuel, and we've come to chapters 18 to 20. And this is David's school of brokenness, so that he doesn't become King Saul II. No one was pointing a gun at him only because guns had not yet been invented. Rather, the most powerful person in his life, his king, was throwing spears at him over and over again. And he wasn't missing by much. David's king, King Saul, the king that the people had wanted, was mad. And he was throwing spears. And so David was faced with a question. What do you do when someone throws a spear at you? Particularly when that person is someone that God has placed in a position of authority over you. What if your spear thrower is God's anointed? What do you do? What do you do when someone's throwing spears at you? Today you might find yourself in a place where persons of authority in your life are throwing spears at you. And what are you supposed to do with your spear thrower? Will you enter into God's school of brokenness? Now, David doesn't seem to know what to do when someone is throwing spears at him, which is somewhat strange because it seems that everybody else knows what to do when a spear is thrown at them, right? You pick it up and you throw it right back. You wrench the spear out of the wall and throw it back as hard as you can. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Our text today is chapters 18 to 20, 1 Samuel. And we left off last week where David had defeated Goliath, the Philistine giant. So let me tell you briefly the story of these 3 chapters. After David had defeated Goliath, it seems that everyone loved him. He was a national hero. Everyone in the kingdom loved David, and particularly one person is mentioned. It's King Saul's son, Jonathan. Now, I've always, in the story of David and Jonathan, I've always thought of them as contemporaries, but it turns out that Jonathan was actually about 30 years older than David. And this is what it says, 1 Samuel 18, verses 3 and 4. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe that he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, as the king's son, Jonathan was next in line for the throne. But here he is showing that he believes that David should be the one in line for the throne. When he gives his robe, his sword, he is giving to David all the things that are the outward symbols that identify him as the king's son. He is giving his kingdom, his authority over to David and saying, David, you should be the next king. Now, following the battle with Goliath, David is brought into Saul's court. In essence, he's become a member of Saul's family. Partly, he's part of the family, and he's in a place, he's growing in a position to become the next king. Whatever Saul asks David to do, David is successful at it. And so Saul gave him a high rank in the army, which caused David to lead the army into battles. And whatever he did, he was successful. So the people loved him. The army loved him, in part because he was fulfilling the role that Saul was to fulfill, the role that Saul had abandoned. The women sang and danced about David's victories. They sang, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. Everyone loved David. But then things started to turn bad. We are told numerous times, over and over again, we're told Saul was jealous and afraid of David. The fear and jealousy just continued to grow in Saul. The more successful and more popular and loved David became, the more jealous and angry and fearful Saul became. He really was quite mad. So look at these verses at chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. The next day an evil spirit came from God and came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. The word prophesying that's used here, I'm not sure exactly, like in practice, what was happening, but it seems to mean that a spirit came upon Saul in such power that it resulted in him throwing his spear at David. You see, Saul is really quite mad, driven by fear and jealousy. Now, since Saul wasn't able to kill David by throwing a spear at him, he decided on another tactic, and that tactic was he would send David to the front lines and let the Philistines kill him. But every time he did that, David would lead the troops into victory, and he became even greater hero, greater success, and the people loved him all the more, so it backfired. So there was a new plan. Saul offers David one of his daughters as his wife if he goes into battle. And the idea behind this is that David would be so starstruck by the idea that he would marry the king's daughter that he would go with reckless abandonment into conflict and take chances that he shouldn't take, and the Philistines would kill him. So David refuses out of humbleness to say, I'm not worthy to be the king's son-in-law. So the first daughter passes by without David, but there's a second one who loves him. And David agrees, takes on the Philistines, but this whole thing backfires on Saul because David is again successful, and his reputation, his popularity only continues to grow. And not only that, but now he's also a member of Saul's household. He's Saul's son-in-law. Now, chapter 19 describes 3 or 4 further murder plots by Saul to kill David. In the first one, Saul asks his attendants to finish David off, but Jonathan, Saul's son, intervenes and talks Saul down and restores peace, and Saul agrees, okay, David's not such a bad guy after all. But that doesn't last long. Again, Saul is kind of in one of his raving fits, and David is there playing the harp for him, and again, Saul tries to pin David to the wall with his spear, and now David escapes by running to his own house. So Saul sends men to David's house to catch him, surround him, kill him there. But now it's Saul's daughter that intervenes, tricks Saul's men, allows David to escape, and David now runs to Samuel. And so Saul sends men to Samuel to catch David and kill him. But as his men approach Samuel and Saul, the Holy Spirit comes upon them. And again, I don't know exactly what this means, but the men start prophesying. And they're unable to follow through on their action to kill David. And so Saul sends a second bunch, and the same thing happens to them. And so he sends a third bunch, same thing happens to them. And so he finally decides he's going to go and take care of this himself. And the same thing happens to him, only in a greater degree. It says that the Spirit came upon him, he ripped his clothes off, and lay naked on the ground all day and all night, prophesying. Saul is mad. He's a pathetic figure, laying on the ground, naked. He becomes the brunt of people's jokes. Whatever it means that Saul was prophesying, whatever that was, it didn't empower him. It disempowered him. So he could not fulfill his plan to murder David. Now, chapter 20 is the part of the story where David is forced to make a decision. All these attempts, you'd think, David, come on. Saul's been trying to kill you this many times. Don't you think it's about time to move on and get out of there? And that's the decision. Does he stay? Does he go? And so chapter 20 is this long, detailed discussion between him and Jonathan, secret ways to communicate, a test, a trick of Saul to make sure to test where his heart is. And I think the whole point of this chapter is to convince Jonathan that indeed his dad really intends to kill David. At one point, Jonathan is forced to kind of choose sides between David and his father. He chooses David, and so Saul throws a spear at him. The king is really quite mad. It seems like throwing spears is his thing. That's what he does. The end result is that David is forced to flee for his life from Saul. He leaves alone. You see, he was a young, popular leader. He's a hero in society. He could have gathered up a bunch of people to follow him. He could have split the kingdom. But he doesn't. He leaves alone, out into the wilderness by himself. Now, what can we learn from this story? You've noticed that I called it God's school of brokenness. David would go on to become Israel's greatest king. There never was like a king like him before or after. But that would not have happened if he didn't go through the school of brokenness. Picture a young man taking care of the sheep. He's the youngest brother of 8 boys. You know that little brother that nobody takes seriously? That's him. But suddenly everything changes. Samuel shows up and anoints him in front of his brothers as the next king of Israel. Then it's discovered that he has a special talent with music, and he's invited into Saul's court to play music for the king when he's raving mad. And the music calms him down. And then David becomes a national hero by killing the giant. And then he's given command over the army, and he's successful. Whatever he does, he's successful. His best friend is the king's son, and he marries the king's daughter. Everything is going right for him. Now, all of this, you can see how all of this could go to a young man's head, and he would become very arrogant. And then he would be on the path to becoming King Saul II. So God takes David through some very painful years. And this story, what we've looked at, is the beginning of quite a number of years in the school of brokenness. Now let me go through this story again for you with the idea of the school of brokenness in mind. And as we do, I invite you to think about the kings in your life, past and present, and how it is that you've responded to these kings. David sang for the mad king often. The music helped the old man calm down, but the king was really quite mad, and therefore he was jealous. Or was it the other way around? Either way, the king felt threatened by David, as kings often do when there's a talented and popular young man under their authority. The king knew, as David did, that this boy might one day take his job. So would David ascend to the throne by fair means or foul means? Saul didn't know. This is one of the things that drove him mad. By his reactions, we see that David seemed to understand something that most people will never understand. And it's this. God did not have, but God wanted to have, but God did not have people who would live in pain. God wanted a broken leader. The mad king saw David as a threat to his kingdom. And so Saul did what mad kings do. He threw spears at David. He threw spears because he could. You see, he was king, and kings can do that sort of thing. In fact, they almost always do. Kings claim the right to throw spears. Now, to complicate this for David, in his case, this mad king was in fact the true king. He was the Lord's anointed. He was placed there by God. Now, if your king is truly the Lord's anointed, and he is throwing spears at you, you can know two things for sure. The first is, your king is really quite mad. And secondly, your king is after the order of King Saul. But you see, God has a university. It's a small school, not many people enroll, and even fewer people graduate. God has this school because he does not have a lot of broken people. He has other kind of people, several types. People who claim to be broken and who are not. People who claim to be anointed by God and are not. But people who are anointed but are quite mad and unbroken. He has lots. He has abundance of those kind of people. He's got everything in between in abundance. But he doesn't have broken people, hardly any at all. David once was a student in this school. And Saul was God's chosen instrument, God's chosen way to crush David. As the king grew in madness, David grew in understanding. He knew that God had placed him in the king's palace under the king's authority. The authority of King Saul. True authority. God's chosen authority. Chosen for David, unbroken authority, but divine in appointment nonetheless. Is that possible? Yes. David drew in his breath, placed himself under the authority of his mad king, and moved down the road further into his own personal hell. Sorry about this. I didn't expect this. just to say I've lived some of this. So David had to ask a question. What do you do when your God-appointed king throws a spear at you? Now, as I said before, it does seem strange that David doesn't know, because it seems like everybody else knows. You pick up the spear and you throw it back. And in doing this small thing, in throwing back the spear, you prove a whole bunch of things. Here's what you prove. You're courageous. You stand for what is right. You boldly stand against what is wrong. You're tough, and you can't be pushed around. You will not stand for injustice or unfair treatment. You are a defender of the faith, the keeper of the flame, the detector of heresy. You will not be wronged. All these combine to prove one more thing. You're actually a good candidate for kingship. Maybe even the Lord's anointed. And you prove this as well. You will be a king after the order of King Saul. There's also the possibility that 20 years down the road, you'll be the best spear thrower in all the kingdom. More skilled and able to throw spears than anybody else. And by then, most assuredly, you will also be mad. Unlike everybody else in spear throwing history, David didn't seem to know what to do when a spear was thrown at him. He did not throw the spear back. He did not make his own spears. There was something different about David. All he did was dodge. What can a young man do when his king decides to use him as target practice? What if the young man doesn't throw back the spears? By the way, it's easy to tell when somebody's been hit by a spear. They turn a deep shade of bitterness. David never got hit. Gradually, he learned the secret. He discovered 3 things that prevented him from ever being hit. They are these. Never learn to throw a spear. It's an easily mastered art, but never learn to throw spears. Secondly, stay out of the company of other spear throwers. And third, keep your mouth shut. In this way, spears will never touch you. I'm sorry. In this way, spears will never touch you, even if they pierce your heart. So you might say, what do you do in the middle of a knife-throwing contest? Now, you may not have liked this whole idea of God's school of brokenness, then you aren't going to like this part either. What do you do in the middle of a knife-throwing contest? You get stabbed to death. You say, what? Why? Why? The answer is because you have your eyes on the wrong Saul, the wrong King Saul. As long as you look at your king, you will blame him and him alone for everything you're going through, your present hell. Be careful. For God has his eyes fastened sharply on a different King Saul. Not the visible one in front of you throwing spears at you. No, God is looking at another Saul, another King Saul, that is just as bad. God is looking at the King Saul in you. Saul is in your bloodstream. He makes up the very flesh and muscle of your heart. He is mixed into your soul. King Saul is one with you. You are King Saul. He breathes in your lungs. And there's only one way to get rid of him. He must be annihilated. Now, this might not be particularly encouraging to you right now if you're in a situation where your King Saul is throwing spears at you. But at least you will know why God has put you under someone who might just be a King Saul. David was a sheep herder who would have grown up to be King Saul II, except God cut away the Saul inside David's heart. The operation took years, and it was a brutalizing experience that almost killed the patient. And what were the scalpel and tongs that God used for this operation to remove the inner Saul? God used the outer Saul. King Saul sought to destroy David, but his only success was he became the servant of God to put to death the Saul that roamed freely in the caverns of David's heart. It's true that David was virtually destroyed in the process, but it had to be this way. Otherwise, the Saul in him would have survived. David accepted his fate. He embraced cruel circumstances. He lifted no hand nor offered any resistance. Neither did he pretend to be more spiritual than he really was. Silently, privately, he bore the pain. Because of this, he was deeply wounded. His whole inner being was mutilated. But he became a different person. The person who could become King David, a king like Israel has never had. God used Saul in the school of brokenness to develop David into the king that would rule God's people like no other king did. And so for the question for us this morning is, do you have a King Saul in your life right now who's throwing spears at you? If you do, two things. Learn how to dodge. And whatever you do, do not pick up his spear and throw it back, because then you'll become just like him. In God's school of brokenness, you can know two things for sure. First of all, you will be broken. Secondly, God will eventually intervene and vindicate you. And in the process, you will become a different person. God will shape your character. You will become a man or woman of God that is awesome. And you will have huge impact on the people around about you. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this story of David dodging the spears of King Saul as he seeks to kill him, and David doesn't retaliate for years. But in the process, you change David. He becomes the man after your own heart. Father, we don't want people pointing guns at us. We don't want people throwing spears at us. But sometimes we know that that is the way in which we grow. The way we become people of character and strength. Give us the the humbleness to enroll in your school of brokenness, to not pick up spears or throw them back, to not announce to everyone how spiritual we're becoming because look at how wonderfully I responded. But I pray that you might develop us to be the men and women that you are looking for. Amen.